Hare Krishna devotees, welcome to day 7 of our Bhakti Vaibhava seminar on Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 3. Canto 3, and we're in the 3rd chapter. Today we're beginning from verse 15. So, here we go. First of all, our prayers. Nama Om Vishnupadaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutale Shrimati Bhaktivedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Deve Gauravani Pracharane Niravishesha Shunyavadi Pastyachadesha Tarne Sri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Sri Advaita Gadadha Shivas Adi Gaura Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Vanchkalpatarubhyascha kripa sindhubhya evacha, Patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Right, yes, so here we are. 3rd Canto, Chapter 3. Beginning with verse 15. When they quarrel among themselves, influenced by intoxication, with their eyes red like copper because of drinking, madhu, then only will they disappear. Otherwise it will not be possible. On my disappearance, this incident will take place. So this is Lord Krishna thinking to himself about how to get the Yadu dynasty to leave this world. Yes. So it's the Yadu dynasty. We read actually yesterday how they were a type of a burden. Yeah, anyway, you can go back and have a look at what we discussed yesterday to understand this point about how Krishna felt the Yadu dynasty was a burden for the earth. It's a really interesting thing. We won't go through it again today. But the bottom line or the conclusion was the Lord felt they need to leave this world, the Yadu dynasty, and then himself. Right, so that's what's being discussed here in verse 15. Let's have a look at the purport. Prabhupada makes the point that the Lord and his associates appear and disappear by his will and not just by the regular laws of material nature which control everybody else, basically. And they're very, very special. No one's able to kill them. There's not also a possibility of them dying from, you might say, natural causes, some disease or old age, something like that. So the only means was what Prabhupada calls, the only means for them leaving this world, Prabhupada calls a make show of a fight among themselves, as if brawling in a state of intoxication due to drinking. So that fighting also took place by the will of the Lord. Otherwise, they could never fight with each other. Not possible. So therefore, this is something which happens and has happened already in the Bhagavatam in a number of cases, that particular people, particular devotees, they become bewildered by the arrangement of the Lord, and therefore something very special happens. Arjuna was bewildered in the beginning of Bhagavad Gita, but it was just to facilitate the speaking of Bhagavad Gita. Maharaj Parikshit was bewildered by the Lord's arrangement to offend Shamakarishi, and in this way he got cursed. It's all the Lord's arrangement. Bhishma similarly. So also here with the Yadus, they were intoxicated by the will of the Lord. Nothing other than that. Yeah. So yes, devotees, associates of the Lord, they're surrendered souls. So they're always instruments in the hands of the Lord, ready to be used by the Lord in any way that he wants. And the pure devotees enjoy these types of pastimes. Of course, in one sense, they enjoy any pastimes of the Lord, but even these very extraordinary pastimes where things apparently on the surface go wrong, but it's all by the Lord's arrangement, so the pure devotees enjoy those pastimes. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying that the devotees of the Lord never assert their independent individuality. On the contrary, they utilize their individuality in pursuit of the desires of the Lord, to facilitate the desires of the Lord. And this cooperation of the devotees with the Lord creates a perfect scene for the Lord's pastimes. Okay, so let's go on to verse 16 and then further. Verse 16, there's no purport. Let's just read through and go on to verse 17. Verse 16, Lord Sri Krishna, thus thinking to himself, established Maharaj Yudhisthira in the position of supreme control of the world, in order to show the ideal of administration on the path of piety. And verse 17, the embryo of Puru's descendant, begotten by the great hero Abhimanyu in the womb of Uttara, his wife, was burnt by the weapon of the son of Drona, but later he was again protected by the Lord. Right, so we read about that. Of course, that was in the first canto, where the story of the appearance of Parikshit was described in considerable detail. So anyway, as the verse says, Parikshit's embryonic body was already there in Uttara's womb, but was burned by Ashvatthama's Brahmastra. But then the Lord gave him a second body within the womb. Didn't just save that initial body, but that body, first initial body, was burnt and damaged. So Krishna gave Parikshit a second body within the womb, and this saved Parikshit. And Prabhupada makes the point that this is proof that the body and the living entity, the soul, are different. And then Srila Prabhupada goes into a description of how our material bodies are formed at the time of conception. But then if the body is destroyed, if that body is destroyed, then the living entity has to take shelter of another body in another womb, another mother. So in this case then, this living entity was Parikshit, who was not ordinary and who had a great destiny to be the successor of Maharaj Yudhisthira. So therefore, when Ashvatthama destroyed the initial embryo of Parikshit, the Lord, by his own internal potency, entered the womb of Uttara to give audience to Parikshit, who was in that dangerous situation. And in this way, By doing this, Krishna encouraged Parikshit and gave him protection in a new body within the same womb by his omnipotency. And Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, by his power of omnipresence, he was present both inside and outside of Uttara and other members of the Pandava family. All right, let us go on to verse 18. The Supreme Lord induced the son of Dharma to perform 3-horse sacrifices, and Maharaj Yudhisthira, constantly following Krishna, the personality of Godhead, protected and enjoyed the earth, assisted by his younger brothers. So, the 3-horse sacrifices after the Battle of Kurukshetra done by Yudhisthira, that's also been described back there in the first canto, around the description of the passing of Bhishma and Bhishma instructing Yudhisthira. But anyway, Uddhava is sort of recapping many of the Lord's pastimes here. So anyway, Prabhupada describes that Yudhisthira was the ideal king on earth because of being such a staunch devotee, constant follower of the Lord. Prabhupada refers to the Ishopanishad, which explains that the Lord is the proprietor of the creation, and the whole idea is to give the conditioned souls a chance to revive their eternal relationship with the Lord and go back to Godhead. And the whole situation in the material world is arranged with that in mind. In other words, that is the actual purpose of the material world. And things like having an opportunity to enjoy, it's not really the idea. Although the material world provides that, or the material world provides the opportunity to suffer through doing nonsense. But those things are more or less by the way. The actual reason that the Lord creates this world and makes it work the way it does is to give the conditioned souls the opportunity to get out of Maya and go back to Godhead. And anyone who doesn't do that, they become punished by the laws of material nature. So Yudhisthira then was installed on the throne because he was just the perfect representative of the Lord, which is what the king or head of state is meant to be. Yes. So therefore, as a result, both the king and the subjects were happy in discharging their worldly duties. The people were protected. They had nice natural life with full cooperation of material nature. And this was all going on during Yudhisthira's reign and following him during the reign of Parikshit. And then the idea would be after Parikshit also the same thing would continue happening. Verse 19, simultaneously the personality of Godhead enjoyed life in the city of Dwaraka, strictly in conformity with the Vedic customs of society. He was situated in detachment and knowledge as enunciated by the Sankhya system of philosophy. That's an interesting point. So anyway, Prabhupada points out that when Yudhisthira was emperor, Krishna was the king of Dwaraka. I mean, strictly speaking, he was a prince, but Ugrasena, the king let Krishna do as he liked. So Krishna then, in his capacity there in Dwaraka, he was known as Dwarkadish, the master of Dwaraka, but he was subordinate to Maharaj Yudhisthira. So even though Krishna is the supreme everywhere, what to speak of on this little planet, he's just the supreme everywhere. But he maintained the standards of Vedic injunctions by acting as a subordinate under Yudhisthira. So then Prabhupada goes into the idea of following the Sankhya philosophy. This is sort of indirectly there, just naturally when one follows Krishna consciousness, that according to Sankhya, the Sankhya analysis of how the material world works, the devotee sees how the world is working and then engages the world in the Lord's service in terms of how it works naturally, which is realized through the descriptions of Sankhya philosophy. And without that knowledge, and then acting on that knowledge, Prabhupada makes the point, human life is no better than animals. Eat, drink, be merry, and at least try to be merry. Try to enjoy, but usually people are not that successful. So like this, the Lord was living like this, as he liked, but he was setting an example that we should live in that way, as the real Sankhya philosophy analyzes the material world. We should live like that in Krishna consciousness. And this all means, Prabhupada explains, knowledge means to know that the mission of human life is to end all the miseries of material existence, and that in spite of having to fulfill bodily necessities in a regulated way, you have to be detached from the bodily level of life, of eat, drink, be merry, etc., which is an animal way of life, on the basis of that understanding, that knowledge. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, fulfilling the demands of the body is animal life, and fulfilling the mission of the spirit soul is the human mission. Right, so on to verse 20. So the Lord, he was there in his transcendental body, the residence of the goddess of fortune, with his usual gentle and sweetly smiling face, his nectarian words, and his flawless character. So Prabhupada makes the point at the beginning of the purport here for verse 20, that the previous verse, which we just read, 19, it described how Krishna was situated in the understandings of Sankhya philosophy, and on that basis he was detached from matter. But now this verse 20 is explaining that he is the residence of the goddess of fortune. And Prabhupada makes the point that these things are not contradictory. Yeah. Being detached, completely detached, but at the same time the residence of the goddess of fortune. So Prabhupada makes the point, he's detached from all types of inferior things, the inferior material nature, but he's eternally enjoying the spiritual nature. Goddess of Fortune, of course, is spiritual nature. But unfortunately, foolish people nowadays, poor fund of knowledge, they don't understand the distinction between the external and internal potencies. Yes. So, Bhagavad Gita, though it points out these things, Prabhupada makes the point that Bhagavad Gita describes the internal potency as para prakriti, which means superior energy. Vishnu Purana says it's para shakti, and the Lord is never, even though he's detached from the inferior material nature, he's never detached from that para shakti, that higher spiritual nature, the internal potency. And the para shakti is described in Brahma Samhita, verse 37. At least Prabhupada just refers to one line from the verse, Ananda Chinmaya Rasa Pratibhavatabi. Yeah, Ananda Chinmaya Rasa. Yes, transcendental. The Lord's eternally joyful and knowledgeable in the taste derived from that Ananda Chinmaya Rasa Pratibhavatabi. So, and Prabhupada makes a really classic foundational point about inferior nature, superior nature, that negating the variegatedness and whatnot of the inferior nature doesn't mean that we're going to negate the positive transcendental bliss of the superior nature of the spiritual world. And therefore his gentleness and his smile, they're all transcendental, and the devotees relish them, although they don't relish the so-called enjoyments of material life and materialistic people. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, such manifestations of the internal potency are the reality, of which the material shadow is only a temporary representation, from which everyone with proper knowledge must be detached. So this material world is just a shadow representation of the actual transcendental reality of the internal potency in the spiritual world. So the material world's just like a shadow, and it's just temporary. So therefore intelligent people must be completely detached from it. Verse 21, the Lord enjoyed his pastimes both in this world and in other worlds, the higher planets, specifically in the association of the Yadu dynasty. At leisure hours offered by night, he enjoyed the friendship of conjugal love with women. Yes, so anyway, the thing is that the Supreme Lord here within this world enjoys life with his pure devotees, not with the materialistic people, and not with different material sense objects. Yeah. So, and Prabhupada makes again the same very important point. He's very attached to his pure devotees when he's here on this planet. And he's also attached to, appreciates, I mean, not as much as with his pure devotees, but with the demigods and the heavenly planets who manage the universe on his behalf. because they are devotees. They're not quite the same generally as the great pure devotees, but still they're devotees. So the Lord has affection or attachment for them. So, but particularly, Prabhupada explains, he displayed special attachment for his family members, the Yadus, and for his wives. And these relationships, these attachments, are all manifestations of the internal potency. The external potency is simply a shadow of that. And, this idea of a shadow is very important and very clear, that if there's some person who you're attracted to and you want to enjoy their material body, but they say, no, you can't, but you can enjoy my shadow. You can embrace my shadow and, in this way try to get enjoyment. Then this is obviously a recipe for just failure and foolishness and uselessness. But the Lord's always attached to his pure devotees, even the demigods, but no attachment at all for the external potency, because it's just a shadow of the internal potency. And Prabhupada refers to Skanda Purana Prabhas Kanda, talks between Lord Shiva and Gauri Parvati. They talk about the manifestation of his internal potency and confirm all these things. And there it says that the Lord met with 16,000 gopis, cowherd damsels, although he's the transcendental supersoul and maintainer of all beings. So there's these gopis. Then Prabhupada goes into a description of these gopis. They are a display of the 16 varieties of internal potency, internal potencies. This will be described more in the 10th canto and explained more. There are more than 16 varieties of internal potencies, but definitely the 16 are very wonderful. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, it is said here that Lord Krishna is just like the moon, and the internal potential damsels are like the stars around the moon. So on to verse 22. On to verse 22. The Lord was thus engaged in household life for many, many years, but at last his detachment from ephemeral sex life was fully manifest. Yeah. So on the surface, one might think that this verse 22 is saying that the Lord was materially attached to his, even sexual relationships with his many wives in Dwaraka for many years. But then later on, after he'd been a householder so many years, at the end of all that, he manifested detachment. But up until then, he was not detached. Actually, he was always detached. The relationships were always transcendental. But later, just to teach others. So anyway, while he was a householder, he taught others how to be householders. Yeah. And then later, he taught everyone how to be detached. So in the verse itself, the last word, samajayata, means fully exhibited. Srila Vishwanath Chakravarti Thakur explains that term in that way. So in other words, while the Lord was here on earth, he exhibited detachment fully. Samajayata, fully exhibited detachment. And he did that particularly when he wanted to teach people by example that one shouldn't remain attached to household life forever. Gradually one should develop detachment from household life. So his detachment from household life doesn't mean he was detached from his eternal devotees, the gopis. The Lord's detachment from household life does not indicate detachment from his eternal associates, the transcendental cowherd damsels, the gopis. But the Lord wanted to end his so-called attachment to the modes of material nature, which was not really there. So, but otherwise, he can never be detached from the service of his pure devotees, like Rukmini and other goddesses of fortune. And this will be clarified further in Brahma Samhita, verse 29. Prabhupada just mentions one line, Lakshmi Sahasra Shatasam Brahma Sevyamanam. He is always surrounded by so many goddesses of fortune. Alrighty, verse 23. Every living entity is controlled by a supernatural force, and thus his sense enjoyment is also under the control of that supernatural force. No one therefore can put his faith in Lord Krishna's transcendental sense activities, but except for one who has become a devotee of the Lord by rendering devotional service. Well, that's very interesting and very important, actually, that no one can really have faith in the Lord and his activities unless they're devotees engaged in devotional service. Right. So in the purport here, Srila Prabhupada makes the point, no one can understand Krishna's birth and activities except the devotees. The devotees understand the difference between the Lord's birth and activities and the birth and activities of the conditioned souls. The devotees understand these differences very vividly on a really foundational level. So anyway, Prabhupada goes on, that the sense enjoyment of animals, men, and demigods, of course demigods were spoken of as devotees a couple of verses ago, but on another level, in another sense, they can be seen as being materially conditioned. So therefore, in terms of being materially conditioned, then we should understand that the sense enjoyment of the animals, the humans, and the demigods is always controlled by the supernatural power of Prakriti or Daivi Maya. And people, the thing is, these poor people, that people who are under that Daivi Maya or Prakriti, they cannot believe, they become unable to digest, to believe, to accept to even consider seriously that Krishna is not under that supernatural power of Prakriti or Daivi Maya. So these people, these materialistic people, can't understand that his senses are transcendental and any of his senses can do anything. Conditioned souls, they can't even dream of this. It's just beyond them in another dimension. But the thing is that even for these non-devotees, that if they engage in devotional service, then they can understand the Lord and understand that his activities are always transcendental. So Srila Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, as the Lord says in Bhagavad Gita 1855, Bhaktyamam abhijanati yavanyaschasmi tatvataha. One cannot know even a fraction of the activities of the Lord if one is not a pure devotee of the Lord. All right, so on we go to verse, the section from verse 24 to verse 28, which is describing the disappearance of Lord Sri Krishna, at least the first discussion about it. Yes, there will be more also as time goes on. Right, so this is verse 24 to verse 28, which happens to be the last verse of this whole chapter. And I'd say there's a very good chance that we will be able to conclude this chapter in this session today. So, okay, verse 24. Once upon a time, great sages were made angry by the sporting activities of the princely descendants of the Yadu and Bhoja dynasties. And thus, as desired by the Lord, the sages cursed them. This is all now in the context of the disappearance of the Lord, which also includes the disappearance of the Yadu dynasty. And later on, the whole sequence of activities will be described, but much later on. I can just mention here that the sporting activities of the princely descendants of the Yadu and Bhoja dynasties, some of Krishna's grandchildren headed by Samba, who Samba is the son of, I think, Pradyumna, or maybe Aniruddha. There was a gathering of great sages, even Narada Muni was there, in Dwaraka, and these young boys thought they'd have a nice joke at the expense of these great sages. So they dressed up one of the girls, it may have actually been, one of the boys, it may have been Samba himself, dressed him up as if he was a pregnant young woman, and went in front of these sages and asked, "Can you please tell us what sort of child this young lady will give birth to?" They're just trying to be sarcastic and mock the great sages. So the sages responded that this girl will give birth to a lump of iron, which will be the cause of the destruction of the Yadu dynasty. And the boys thought, this is a good joke, we're having a good laugh. But when they heard that, they were shocked. And then actually Samba gave birth to a block of iron, which they took to Ugrasena, who was the king. What to do? Can we get rid of this somehow? So he had it filed down into powder, this lump of iron, and then the powder was thrown into the ocean. Except for the last bit. There was one last bit they couldn't file down, it was too small. So anyway, the powder was washed up on the beach at Prabhasik Kshetra, and then grew into the metal rods, like some sort of cane or something like that. Reeds, these big reeds, but they were metal. And then the Yadu dynasty people, they got into an argument with each other because Krishna's army had fought against Arjuna and Krishna in the Battle of Kurukshetra. But some of the members, like Satyaki, who was the head of Krishna's army, remained on Krishna's side. So when they gathered there and they were drinking rice wine at Prabhasik Kshetra, some sort of mocking happened. And for Kshatriyas, because they're Kshatriyas, if you mock a Kshatriya, that's it. You're going to have to fight the Kshatriya to the death. So then they started grabbing these metal reeds and fighting each other and killed each other. And the last little piece of metal that they couldn't file down any further was swallowed by a fish who was caught by the hunter Jara, who cut the fish open and found that piece of metal, which he made into an arrowhead, which he then fired after the Yadu dynasty had disappeared. Jara fired this arrow with the piece of metal as the arrowhead. He fired it at the lotus foot of Lord Krishna, who was sitting behind a tree. He couldn't see that it's Lord Krishna. He just saw this foot and thought it was maybe some animal. Anyway, that's the background there to this verse 24. Anyway, Srila Prabhupada gives an explanation that the associates of the Lord, who were playing the parts of being members of the Yadu and Bhoja dynasties, they're not ordinary living entities. And it's not possible that such people could offend saintly devotees. It's not possible. They just don't do things like that. They cannot, and they just don't. But it's a special arrangement of the Lord. So not only could they offend devotees as they did by asking what sort of child the young boy would give birth to, not only could the Yadu dynasty people offend the devotees, but the devotees couldn't curse them also, because the devotees knew these are the Lord's personal people. So therefore Prabhupada makes the point, this cursing was another transcendental pastime of the Lord to make a show of anger. And Prabhupada makes the point that the princes were cursed. So we can know that even the descendants of the Lord, who can't be vanquished by material nature, they were subjected to reactions of anger by great devotees. That's a lesson. So Prabhupada concludes the purport to that verse 24. He says, one should therefore take great care and attention not to commit an offense at the feet of a devotee of the Lord. All right, let's go on to verse 25. A few months passed, and then, bewildered by Krishna, all the descendants of Vrishni, Bhoja, and Andaka, who were incarnations of demigods, went to Prabhas, while those who were eternal devotees of the Lord did not leave, but remained in Dwaraka. So there's no purport. We go on to verse 26. After arriving there, all of them took bath, and with the water of this place of pilgrimage, they offered their respects to the forefathers, demigods, and great sages, and thus satisfied them. They gave cows to the Brahmins in royal charity. Right, so in the purport here, Srila Prabhupada, verse 26, purport, Prabhupada, the first point he makes, which is important, and it's really something we got to understand, that there are different divisions of devotees. There are some who are Nitya Siddhas, they're eternally perfect, and some are sadhana siddhas, means they become perfect through sadhana, through practice, through working on their Krishna consciousness, they come to the level of perfection. So of these, of the sadhana, well anyway, the Nitya Siddhas never fall down. Even though they may come to the material world sometimes to help execute the mission of the Lord. But the sadhana siddhas, they're from the conditioned souls. And amongst those sadhana siddhas, sadhana devotees, well, amongst the sadhana devotees, there are mixed devotees and then pure devotees. The mixed devotees are sometimes enthusiastic about fruitive activities or speculating. It can happen, even though they're devotees, but they're mixed with lower things like fruitive activities, speculations. But the pure devotees, particularly Prabhupada's referring to the pure sadhana siddhas, but of course it would also apply to the Nitya Siddhas who are just pure anyway. But those pure devotees from amongst the sadhana devotees, the sadhana siddhas, who have become perfect through devotional service, all of those pure devotees, they're always free from any mixtures. They're just absorbed in devotional service, regardless of how they're situated, where they're situated, any considerations like that. And the pure devotees, Prabhupada makes the point, they don't want to put aside their service in order to visit holy places. And Prabhupada quotes Narottam Das Thakur at the end of the first paragraph of the purport here, of verse 26. To visit holy places of pilgrimage is another bewilderment of the mind, because devotional service to the Lord at any place is the last word in spiritual perfection. So Prabhupada goes on into the second paragraph of this purport. For the pure devotees, they're completely satisfied in devotional service, so they feel no need to visit pilgrimage places. But those who are not so advanced, they may feel that they have to do certain prescribed duties of visiting pilgrimage places and perform certain rituals like that. So Prabhupada concludes the second paragraph by saying the part of the princely order of the Yadu dynasty who went to Prabhas performed all duties to be done in a place of pilgrimage and offered their pious actions to their forefathers and others. Yeah. So then there's a third paragraph that as a rule, everyone is indebted to Krishna, to the demigods, great sages, other living entities, people in general, forefathers, and so many others for the various contributions that they've got from all these different personalities or groups of personalities. And they at least the honest ones, they feel they have to repay those debts. I mean, actually, everyone has to repay the debts. But those who are pious, they feel they want to and they try to. So Prabhupada concludes the purport by saying, the Yadus who went to the Prabhas pilgrimage site performed their duties by distributing land, gold, and well-nourished cows in royal charity, as described in the following verse, which, of course, now is verse 27. So let's have a look at verse 27. The Brahmins were not only given well-fed cows in charity, but also gold coins, bedding, clothing, animal skin seats, blankets, horses, elephants, girls, and sufficient land for maintenance. So, in the purport here, Prabhupada makes the point, all these different charities mentioned, we just read in the verse, they're for Brahmins, whose lives are just devoted to the welfare of society spiritually and materially. Those Brahmins are never paid salaries, but they're just provided with all necessities by the other members of society. If they needed a wife, they were given a wife and money. So there were no economic problems and no problems just with their regular lives, everyday lives. The Kshatriyas and Vaishyas would provide, yes. So therefore the Brahmins could remain dedicated to the elevation of society. But later, when the Brahmins became easygoing and taking advantage of being looked after nicely, even though they lacked real qualification, then they became Brahma Bandhus, disqualified Brahmins. And then as a result, other members of society fell down too. So Prabhupada, right at the end, let me just read the last sentence of the purport of this verse 27. Prabhupada says, as described in Bhagavad Gita, the caste system is the creation of the Lord and is arranged according to the quality of work rendered to society and not in terms of birthright, as falsely claimed in the present degraded society. So on to verse 28, which is the last verse of this third chapter. Here's the verse itself. Thereafter they offered the Brahmins highly delicious foodstuffs, first offered to the personality of Godhead, and offered their respectful obeisances by touching their heads to the ground. They lived perfectly by protecting the cows and the Brahmins. So there are 3 paragraphs of purport here. It's fairly substantial. First point Prabhupada makes is that the Yadu dynasty people who were there at Prabhas, they were highly cultured, and their behavior was highly cultured to the point of, Prabhupada says, human perfection. And that human perfection is attained by 3 things: cow protection, Brahminical culture, and above all, becoming an actual devotee and pure devotee of the Lord. Without that, becoming a pure devotee, then you can't perfect your human life, which is what is said the Yadus had done. So the perfection then of human life is to go to the spiritual world. That's the highest perfection. There's no birth, death, old age, disease there. And Prabhupada says, without this aim, any amount of material advancement and so-called comforts can only bring the defeat of the human form of life. Second paragraph. So Prabhupada explains the Brahmins and Vaishnavas, they don't accept any food which is not offered to the Lord. Yeah. And they accept that as mercy. In fact, prasadam means the mercy of the Lord. The Lord is supplying all food to every living being. So the humans particularly must be conscious of the fact that all these foodstuffs, grains, vegetables, milk, water, everything is supplied by the Lord. And it cannot come from scientists or factories. And then it's offered to the Lord, it's prasadam, from sacrifice to the Lord Vishnu, the Yajna Purush. Therefore, eating it frees one from sins. But if you cook anything for yourself without offering it, then it all gives sinful reaction, no matter how vegetarian it may be, how nice it may be, how nicely prepared it may be, etc. If it's not offered, it leads to suffering. So therefore, all the food offered at Prabhas was offered to the Lord. And then after that, as the verse says, the Yadus put their heads to the ground, offered humble obeisances. So, Prabhupada concludes the second paragraph here by saying, the Yadus or any enlightened family in Vedic culture are trained for attainment of human perfection by total cooperation of service between the different divisions of social orders. And then we have the last paragraph, just to conclude the whole chapter. Prabhupada points out a word from the verse. Uru rasam is significant. That you can prepare hundreds of delicacies from grains, vegetables, milk, like that. They're all in the mode of goodness, and then they can be offered to the Lord. So the Lord only accepts vegetarian foods, of course, as Bhagavad Gita 9:26, Patram Pushpam Phalam Toyam, states very nicely. So he accepts those types of foodstuffs if they're offered with devotion. Prabhupada says, in complete devotional service. And the criterion for a nice offering, for an acceptable offering, bona fide offering, is devotional service. So then the Yadus, Prabhupada makes the point that it appears that They were perfectly trained, civilized people, and so they're being cursed by the Brahmin sages. It was just the will of the Lord, that's all. But still it's a warning that no one should behave lightly with Brahmins and devotees. They have to be taken very seriously and dealt with properly from the heart. Hare Krishna, Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.